The wind pushed across the Texas plains with a hollow moan, carrying dust and dread in equal measure. Gray clouds hunched low in the sky like an omen, pressing down on the old slaughter-yard as if the weight of what happened there stained even the weather. Beyond the rusted gates, the air was thick with the scent of manure, iron, and something far more tragic, resignation. The horses behind the fence weren't wild anymore. Their eyes, wide and still, held the vacant shimmer of those who understood what came next. And above them, nailed to a splintering post, the word slaughter pen declared this place a sentence, not a home. But one horse didn't blend in. She stood near the gate, her stance defiant yet still. A striking bay Mustang, her coat a deep chestnut with muscles taut beneath, and a sharp white blaze running down her face like a lightning strike. Her dark eyes were steady, intense, not panicked, not dull. Watching. She looked straight at Mavis Turner, as if she had been waiting for her all this time. Mavis wasn't supposed to be there. She had come back to this dry stretch of country to visit an old friend of her father's. But on her way through town, she'd seen the lot from the road, the worn-out fences, the shifting herd, and something old and familiar twisted in her gut. She parked without thinking. Her boots crunched over gravel as she walked toward the pen, the sound muffled by the wind. And then she saw the bay. Not just a horse. The horse. The one with the storm in her eyes. Mavis stepped closer to the fence, raising her hand, breath catching in her throat. "She's pregnant," said a low voice behind her. Mavis turned to see a man in a battered ball cap and denim, a toothpick twitching between his lips. His name tag read Orville. He nodded toward the bay. "Due pretty soon. But she's marked. Headed out tomorrow." Mavis's stomach dropped. Pregnant? She looked back at the Mustang, still watching, still calm. A wave of heat rushed over her chest. It was a feeling she hadn't had since she was a child, hiding in her family's barn, trying to save a calf from dying in the cold while her father said it was no use. That ache was back. But this time, she was no child. The other horses were stirring now, sensing the shift in energy, but the bay stood her ground. It was as if she had chosen Mavis, placed her fate in her hands without a sound. In that still, loaded second, something passed between them. A thread pulled tight across a silent canyon. And as the first low rumble of thunder rolled in from the west, Mavis Turner did something she hadn't done in years. She trusted her heart, and stepped into something she couldn't yet understand. Mavis couldn't sleep that night. Back at the modest guest house just outside town, she lay on the creaky twin bed staring at the ceiling fan above her, its slow rotation doing nothing to quiet the spinning inside her mind. Tempest's eyes haunted her, the way they had locked onto hers, still and unwavering. It wasn't just a horse. It wasn't just pity. There had been something almost human in that connection. Something she hadn't felt in years. And it made her question things she thought she had long buried. She rose before dawn, slipping on her boots and grabbing her jacket. Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked up her car keys. The gravel crunched under her tires as she made her way back to the yard. The slaughterhouse crew would arrive at sunrise, and if she was going to do something, it had to be now. The old gate creaked open as she stepped inside, greeted again by that familiar mix of damp hay and hopelessness. Tempest was still there, in the same corner, still watching. Only now, her ears twitched at Mavis's approach, and her breath steamed softly in the cold morning air. Orville was already on site, sipping from a travel mug and lighting a cigarette. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. "You're back," he muttered, voice gravelly. "Didn't peg you for the sentimental type." "I want her," Mavis said simply. He chuckled, dry and sharp. "She's not for sale. She's contracted, already spoken for. Unless you're willing to pay above board and sign a release. That mare's worth something. Pregnant ones always are." Mavis swallowed hard. Her bank account was modest. She taught art classes part-time back in Tulsa and barely scraped by most months. But the thought of leaving Tempest behind made her stomach twist. She couldn't explain it logically, even to herself. It was like something old and sacred had awakened inside her. A duty she hadn't asked for, but now couldn't ignore. "I'll figure it out," she said. "Just give me until noon." Orville stared at her, smoke curling around his face like fog. Then he gave the faintest nod. Clocks ticking. As Mavis turned back to Tempest, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a number she didn't recognize. She hesitated before answering, and when she did, the voice on the other end froze her blood. It wasn't about the horse. It was about her father, Hollis Turner, dead for almost 8 years. And what the caller said next changed everything. The voice on the other end was low and cautious, like someone trying to ease into a conversation that had no easy beginning. "Is this Mavis Turner?" the caller asked. Mavis glanced toward the pen where Tempest still stood. "Yes," she answered slowly. "Who is this?" There was a pause, too long to be casual. Then, "My name's Irene Whitlock. I knew your father. I worked with him before he passed." Mavis's heart stuttered. Her father had been a quiet man, private to a fault. The kind who left more unsaid than spoken. And as far as she knew, he hadn't worked with anyone in his final years. "I don't mean to intrude," Irene continued, her voice cracking just slightly, "but I think it's time you knew the truth about Hollis. He did something he never told you. It has to do with the wild horses." Mavis froze. A cold breeze swept through the yard, making her pull her jacket tighter. The timing was too strange. She looked back at Tempest, whose ears had perked as if she too sensed the shift in the air. "What are you talking about?" Mavis asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't explain it over the phone," Irene said. "But if you're in town, I'm at the old feed store off Highway 6. Come before noon. Please." Mavis ended the call with her fingers trembling. Her mind raced in too many directions at once. Her father's past. Tempest. The eerie way everything was circling back to the same place. Wild horses, secrets, and the land her family had left behind. She stared at her reflection in the dusty truck window, trying to recognize herself in those tired eyes. The same eyes her father had. The same eyes filled with questions he never answered. She climbed into the truck and started the engine, but her gaze lingered on Tempest. The mare stepped closer to the fence now, as if unwilling to let her go. Mavis reached out and brushed her fingers gently against the horse's cheek. "I'm coming back," she promised softly. "Don't you go anywhere." Tempest blinked slowly, her breath warm and steady. For a moment, it felt like the world paused around them. As the truck rumbled out of the lot and back onto the road, Mavis couldn't shake the feeling that whatever Irene had to say, it wasn't just about her father. It was about why Tempest had found her now, after all these years. The feed store looked like it hadn't been open in decades. Its faded red siding peeled under the weight of time, and the sign above the door creaked in the wind. Mavis parked her truck under a dying pecan tree and sat in silence for a moment. She could feel the tension building in her chest, grief and anticipation tangled together. She hadn't thought of her father in this way for years, not as a man with secrets, but simply as a man who had died too soon, leaving behind a barn full of tools and a silence that never really left the house. Irene Whitlock was waiting inside, seated behind an old counter covered in dust and yellowed receipts. She looked to be in her 70s, with silver hair twisted into a long braid and eyes as sharp as barbed wire. When she saw Mavis, she stood slowly, pressing a hand over her heart. "You look just like Maeve," she whispered. "Your mama had that same fire behind her eyes." Mavis offered a wary smile. "You said you knew my father." Irene nodded, walking over with the slow determination of someone who'd carried too many burdens for too long. I did. I worked with him, back when he ran that sanctuary out by Harlan Ridge. Before everything fell apart. Before he made choices that broke him. Mavis blinked. Sanctuary? Her father had never once mentioned that. He'd always told her the land near Harlan Ridge was cursed ground, best left alone. Irene motioned for her to follow. In a back room filled with old photographs and ledgers, she pointed to a framed black-and-white image of Hollis, younger and stronger, standing beside a group of Mustangs, wild and proud, just like Tempest. He spent 10 years saving them, Irene said. He believed it was his purpose. But the government pulled support. There were threats. He made a deal he never forgave himself for. Mavis stared at the photo, trying to reconcile the man she remembered, quiet, broken, distant, with the one in the picture, standing tall among wild horses, defiant and full of purpose. "Why didn't he tell me?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Because he thought if you knew what he gave up, you'd never forgive him," Irene replied softly. "But Tempest, she's part of that past. She's not just any horse, Mavis. She's tied to what your father tried to protect, and what he couldn't." A sudden gust rattled the old windows. And in that moment, Mavis realized this wasn't just about saving a life. It was about finishing what her father couldn't. The drive back to the slaughter-yard was different this time. Mavis's grip on the steering wheel was tighter. Her eyes burned from holding back tears she didn't even fully understand. The photo of her father standing beside those wild Mustangs kept flashing in her mind, burned into her memory like an old scar she never knew she had. He hadn't just cared about the horses, he had fought for them. And lost. Now, standing on the same line where he had once stood, Mavis realized this wasn't coincidence. Tempest finding her wasn't random. It was inheritance. She pulled into the lot just as the sun began to rise behind a veil of clouds. The place looked colder than before, harsher. The air felt heavier. Tempest was still there, but she had grown agitated, pacing slowly inside the pen, snorting as the trailer truck rumbled to life in the distance. Orville stood beside it, clipboard in hand, eyes narrowing as Mavis approached. "You're late," he said without emotion. "Truck's ready. You got the money?" "I don't have all of it," Mavis admitted, breath quick and shallow. "But I know who she is. I know what she means." Orville raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Lady, these horses aren't symbols. They're meat to some, bills to others. Meaning doesn't get you anywhere in this business." Mavis stepped closer, her voice firm. "My father was Hollis Turner. He ran the Harlan Ridge Sanctuary. That horse, Tempest, she's part of his bloodline. She's carrying a foal that traces back to one of the oldest wild herds in Texas. If you sell her to slaughter, you're not just killing a horse, you're destroying a living piece of American history." Orville hesitated. He stared at her longer than she expected, chewing on the inside of his cheek. "You're serious?" "Yes," she said, voice trembling. "And if you let me walk out of here with her, I'll find a way to make the rest right. I swear it." The silence stretched too long. A low gust of wind stirred the dust. The truck rumbled again, louder this time. Tempest let out a sharp, desperate whinny that cut through Mavis's chest like a blade. She turned to the mare, and Tempest stared back at her with wild, glassy eyes. Then Orville grunted, dropped the clipboard onto the fence post, and muttered, "You've got 1 hour. After that, she's gone." Mavis didn't waste a second. But as she began unlocking the gate, Tempest reared back suddenly. Ears pinned, eyes wide, nostrils flaring at something behind them. And that's when Mavis heard it too. The unmistakable sound of someone else pulling up, who wasn't supposed to be there. The vehicle rolled in slow, its tires crunching over gravel with a heavy finality. It was an older black pickup, dust-caked, with government plates barely visible beneath years of grime. Mavis stepped back from the gate, instinctively shielding Tempest with her body. The mare had gone rigid, her breathing sharp and fast. A tall man in a wind-worn jacket stepped out from the truck, his boots hitting the ground with purpose. He took his time, adjusting his hat as he looked directly at Mavis, eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. Orville stiffened at the sight of him. "What the hell are you doing here, Briggs?" The man, Briggs, didn't answer at first. Instead, he walked slowly toward the fence, scanning the yard like it was property he already owned. "I got a tip," he said finally, voice low and practiced. "One of the Ridgeline Mares survived. Bred, no less. That can't happen." Mavis felt a chill slide down her spine. "She's not for sale," she said firmly. "She's mine now. You're too late." Briggs let out a humorless laugh. "Ownership's tricky when it comes to federal property. That horse is part of a managed herd, or what's left of it. If she bred outside the registry, she's a threat to the entire bloodline preservation protocol. We've got orders." "She's not a threat," Mavis shot back. "She's a survivor. And so was my father." Briggs turned sharply toward her, the mention of Hollis Turner slicing through the air. "Your father made promises he couldn't keep. The Ridge Project fell apart because he went rogue. You really want to follow in his footsteps?" For a moment, Mavis faltered. The pain in her chest flared, the shadow of her father's silence once again pressing down on her. But then she looked at Tempest, trembling but proud, her belly round with life, and something hardened in her. "Yes," she said. "If that means protecting her, then yes. I'll finish what he started." Briggs moved toward the gate, reaching into his coat, not for a weapon, but for paperwork. "Then you better be ready to fight through courts and policy and red tape. Because I'm not leaving without her." But before he could take another step, Tempest reared again, higher this time, her front hooves crashing down inches from the gate. Mavis jumped back, heart pounding. Then she heard it, a sharp cry, not from Tempest, but from inside the pen. A second sound. Smaller. Urgent. Alive. And in that frozen instant, Mavis realized. Tempest was no longer just pregnant. She was giving birth. Mavis rushed to the gate, heart thudding so loud it nearly drowned out everything else. Tempest was down now, on her side, legs kicking weakly in the dirt. Her breathing came in shallow bursts, nostrils flaring with effort. The sharp cry came again. High, piercing, unmistakably new. Mavis dropped to her knees by the fence, reaching through the bars, trying to steady the mare with her voice. "Easy, girl. I'm here. Just breathe. You're not alone." Briggs stood frozen a few feet behind, the papers still in his hand, forgotten. Orville moved instinctively, tossing the clipboard aside and yanking open the gate. "She's not gonna make it through this alone," he muttered. "Not in this damn place." The three of them moved fast, like they'd done it before, even if only one of them truly had. Orville took the lead, guiding Tempest onto softer ground with a pile of hay. Mavis was at her head, stroking her face gently, whispering things she hadn't said to anyone in years, words of comfort, of hope, of family. Her palms trembled, but her heart held firm. This was happening. Here. Now. Between life and loss. And then the foal came. It happened fast, too fast, and for a moment all they could do was watch. A dark, trembling form slid into the world, still slick with afterbirth, legs bent awkwardly beneath a body not quite ready to stand. Mavis's breath caught in her throat. She reached out, barely daring to touch it. "Ember," she whispered. The name had come from nowhere, but once spoken, it felt like truth. Tempest lifted her head, weak but alert. She let out a low, breathy whinny, nudging the foal with her nose. Ember blinked, then wobbled, struggling to find her footing. It was raw, imperfect, but powerful. Mavis felt tears sting her eyes as she watched mother and daughter connect, like a thread being tied between past and future right in front of her. Briggs stood in the doorway, the conflict written plainly across his face. Authority told him to intervene. But something deeper, something human, kept him still. For the first time, he looked at Tempest not as a file number, but as a creature who had just fought for life. He sighed, jaw clenched. "This changes everything," he said quietly. Mavis stood slowly, not looking away from the foal. "No," she said, voice steady. "This is everything." And from somewhere far beyond the walls of the pen, thunder rumbled again, not with threat, but with promise. The next morning came quietly, but it didn't feel like peace. It felt like the eye of a storm. Mavis stood at the edge of the paddock on her mother's land that had once been part of the sanctuary her father tried to build. The fences were worn, the barn sagged with age, and the fields were overgrown. But to Mavis, it felt sacred. It was where everything had started, and maybe where it could begin again. Tempest lay in the fresh straw inside the barn, her breathing calmer now. Ember, still shaky on her legs, wandered in slow circles near her mother's side. The drive from the slaughter-yard had been quiet. No sirens. No agents waiting at the gate. Briggs had kept his word, for now. But 1 week wasn't long. Mavis knew the world outside didn't care about stories or history. It cared about rules, signatures, and numbers. And a single mother with a rescued Mustang and an undocumented foal was just a loose thread someone would want to cut. But she didn't feel afraid. Not anymore. For the first time in years, she felt her feet were on solid ground. Her father's ground. Inside the house, everything still smelled like Mavis Turner. The lavender soap, the old quilts, the wood that creaked in the exact same way it had when Mavis was a child. On the kitchen table lay a stack of old ledgers and photos that Irene had given her, records of Hollis's work with the wild herds, breeding notes, field maps, letters never sent. She pored over them in the dim morning light, her fingers trembling with every new truth. Her father hadn't just fought for the horses, he had loved them. And he'd tried to shield Mavis from the cost of that love, believing she might choose an easier life. But life had brought her right back here. Full circle. Outside, Ember let out a short, startled cry. Mavis rushed to the barn and found her tangled in a feed bucket, legs awkwardly splayed. She freed her gently, lifting the small foal in her arms for a moment. Ember was all bones and trembling heartbeats, but she was alive. A spark wrapped in skin. "You're going to do great things," Mavis whispered into her fur. "You don't even know it yet." From the gate, Orville stood watching, hands in his coat pockets. He didn't speak, but there was something different in his expression. Respect, maybe even hope. He tipped his hat as she looked over. And in that quiet moment, Mavis realized. She hadn't just saved a horse. She was rebuilding a legacy, one heartbeat at a time. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and sleepless nights. Mavis had never been the kind of person who fought systems. She'd always been quieter, more reserved. But now, she was drafting letters, scanning old documents, and calling every contact Irene had handed her. The small table in her mother's kitchen was covered with stacks of folders, faded photographs, and the original land deed Mavis Turner had signed decades ago. Every night, she fell asleep with her boots still on, waking at dawn to start over again. Tempest was healing slowly, though her energy had yet to fully return. Ember had grown stronger with each passing day, her legs more stable, her eyes more curious. She followed Mavis everywhere now, clumsy and persistent, nudging at her pockets, exploring every inch of the barn and fields like she was trying to understand the world she'd barely been allowed to enter. That little foal had become a symbol, not just of survival, but of what might still be possible. On the 5th day, Mavis drove to the county office with Irene by her side. She carried every scrap of proof she had, Photos of the ridge herd, documents with her father's signature, a printed timeline showing the bloodline connection between Tempest and the original sanctuary stock. The clerk behind the desk barely looked up. "You need a state-issued wildlife clearance for any wild foal born on non-designated land," he said flatly. "That'll take months." "I don't have months," Mavis said. "And if you deny this petition, you're erasing more than just a horse. You're erasing a family's history. You're erasing a man's life's work." Irene leaned in, voice calm but firm. "You may not care about bloodlines, but there are senators who do. The ridge herd was part of the federal registry until funding was pulled. We have letters from 2 biologists and a former conservation officer ready to testify. So go ahead and delay us, and see what ends up in the local paper next week." That got the clerk's attention. He took the paperwork slowly, expression unreadable. "We'll escalate it for review." That night, back at the ranch, Mavis stood at the fence, watching the moon rise over the fields her father once walked. Ember rested beside Tempest, curled into her mother's side like a promise that refused to break. A soft breeze lifted the dust from the ground, and for the first time, the land felt awake again. But just before she turned to head inside, Mavis spotted headlights, creeping down the long dirt road. And her heart dropped. It wasn't Briggs. It was someone else. The headlights cut a slow path across the front pasture, and Mavis stepped out onto the porch, heart pounding. She didn't know what, or who, to expect. For a split second, she thought it might be someone sent to take Tempest and Ember away. But when the truck door opened, and a tall woman in a pressed blazer stepped out, holding a leather satchel, Mavis knew this wasn't enforcement. This was something else. "Ms. Turner?" the woman asked, adjusting her glasses. "My name is Colleen Jarvis. I'm with the Texas Department of Environmental Heritage. I came across your petition, and your father's old files. I read everything. Twice." Mavis didn't speak, just nodded cautiously. "I drove here myself because I wanted to see with my own eyes what he tried to preserve. And what you're trying to rebuild." She followed Mavis out to the barn, where Tempest raised her head slowly, eyes alert but calm. Ember peeked from behind her mother's side, stepping forward with unsteady curiosity. The woman knelt in the straw, surprisingly graceful in her skirt suit. "She's magnificent," Colleen whispered. "Both of them are. You were right. This isn't just about policy. It's about preservation. About legacy." Back at the house, over a cup of black coffee, Mavis sat across from her with the same ledgers, maps, and letters spread out. Colleen took her time, reading each page with genuine attention. When she finally closed the last folder, she looked up and smiled. "We can issue an emergency historical conservation waiver. It'll protect both mares as part of a living archive. And it can be expanded." "Expanded?" Mavis asked carefully. "We've been trying to re-establish a heritage sanctuary in the region," Colleen said. "But we've never had a bloodline that goes back as far as this one. If you're willing, we'd like to help you bring it back. Properly this time. With funding. With recognition." Mavis didn't answer right away. She looked out the window, past the field, toward the ridge where her father used to ride. She imagined him there now, standing tall in the wind, one hand on the reins, the other shielding his eyes from the sun. And in that vision, he was smiling. "Yes," she said finally. "Let's bring it back." A week later, new fencing began to rise. Volunteers arrived, along with a camera crew from a local station. Tempest stood proudly in the pasture, and Ember ran circles around her like a living spark. Mavis stood at the gate, one hand resting on the wood, the wind lifting her hair. She wasn't just her father's daughter anymore. She was the future he had always believed in.